It was generally understood in Flaxwell that the Parish Archive room possessed no secrets beyond the dull ones. Its pale wooden cabinets, each lacquered to the same municipal sheen, held minutes of meetings so soporific that even the vicar admitted to skimming them, and committee newsletters of a tone so conscientious that one could practically hear the paper blushing. Miss Eveline Croom regarded these materials with reverence. She had been volunteering in the archive for 16 years and often said that the files kept the parish honest, though no one had ever heard her explain precisely how. On a drab March afternoon, as wind dragged itself reluctantly between the gravestones outside, Miss Croom stood before Cabinet C, her least favourite, as its top drawer squeaked, a sound she interpreted as premature wear. She intended only to file a set of attendance sheets from last month's flower committee, but when she attempted to close the bottom drawer, it refused with a stubborn inch of protest. She frowned at it, the way one might frown at a cat of uncertain temperament. After 3 dignified attempts, she bent slightly to peer inside. A single sheet of yellowed paper had curled to one side, preventing closure. She drew it out carefully, smoothing its corners as she did so. The page contained a memorandum, typed on an older machine whose keys clearly required conviction. Its message was stark: re the P's matter, to be reconsidered discreetly. There was no date, only the signature line: discuss further. Miss Croom had an admirable sense for when something ought not to be found, and she recognized immediately that this memorandum fell neatly into that category. Her first instinct was to reseal the matter inside the drawer and claim never to have seen it. However, a stronger instinct overruled her, the one concerning moral housekeeping. She folded the paper, placed it in her handbag beside a packet of barley sweets, and marched into the corridor with a posture rendered even straighter by caution. Inspector Purbright, when telephoned by Miss Croom, did not sound alarmed. His voice, as always, possessed the tranquillity of someone who had spent years absorbing the gentle misdemeanours of a mild-tempered town. Nevertheless, he agreed to call at the parish hall within the hour. The inspector believed in indulging Miss Croom's concerns. She was, after all, one of the last people still pretending the archive mattered. When Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived, they found Miss Croom waiting with the memorandum laid before her, like evidence of a modest crime. She greeted them with the stern politeness of a schoolmistress, catching pupils out of bounds. "I found this in Cabinet C," she said, looking at Purbright as though expecting him to faint. "It was placed carelessly, and I need hardly tell you that such things are never placed carelessly." Purbright examined the document with mild interest. Love, whose curiosity seldom extended to parish minutiae, leaned forward only far enough to be courteous. "The P's matter," Purbright murmured. "Does the name mean anything to you, Miss Croom?" Miss Croom stiffened. "Nothing personally, Inspector, only that I have never encountered it in any of our records, which—" She paused, letting indignation sharpen her diction. "Strikes me as suspicious." Purbright regarded her thoughtfully. Miss Croom's suspicion of anomalies was usually reliable, though sometimes triggered by phenomena less than criminal. He folded the memo and slipped it into his pocket. "I think we had better speak with the vicar," he said. The vicar, Reverend Sanderson, was found in his office, a room whose primary decoration consisted of framed certificates from various ecclesiastical workshops he had attended. Most conferred expertise in matters like community harmony and the ministry of gentle correction. He greeted the visitors with elaborate warmth, as though fearful they might evaluate his welcome. "Ah, Inspector Purbright, always a pleasure. Please do come in. May I tempt you with a slightly stale biscuit? I fear the parish meeting yesterday rather depleted the fresher ones." Purbright declined with a polite murmur and produced the memorandum. "We wondered if you might know something about this, Reverend." The vicar's smile, though undiminished, developed small cracks of uncertainty. He accepted the paper and read it with the sober concentration one reserves for documents that might or might not incriminate oneself. "The P's matter. he repeated slowly. Goodness, that does take me back. He placed the paper on his desk with a gentleness that suggested further handling might cause it to detonate. Miss Croom allowed herself a small intake of breath. So you do recall it, Reverend? Well, yes, Sanderson said, adjusting his spectacles with pastoral dignity. Harold Pease, a rather private individual as I recall. He lived in the town some years ago, or possibly on its outskirts. My memory is a little hazy. Purbright waited without speaking. Silence, he found, often encouraged elaboration. Sanderson smiled nervously. It was all quite trivial, I'm sure. Some administrative misunderstanding related to, one of the parish subcommittees. Disagreements are not uncommon, you know. In small communities, even minor frictions can become matters of unnecessary drama. Purbright gave a thoughtful nod. And the memorandum suggests this was to be reconsidered discreetly? Oh, yes, Sanderson said quickly. I imagine the discretion referred to keeping the matter from escalating. Mr. Pease was, shall we say, easily stirred. Easily stirred to what? Love asked. Oh, merely opinions, Sanderson replied, his tone encouraging the subject to expire quietly. Purbright felt no compulsion to press him. He thanked the vicar and made to leave, but Sanderson unexpectedly halted him with a courteous cough. Inspector, do you suppose this memorandum requires attention now? It seems to me a relic of no consequence. Purbright regarded him mildly. We shall make a few inquiries, nothing more. I shouldn't worry. Sanderson smiled with visible relief, though his eyes drifted once more to the paper, as though hoping it would dissolve of its own accord. Outside, Miss Croom clasped her hands in a way that implied deep justification. You see, Inspector, the vicar knows something. Purbright did not disagree. The Reverend Sanderson's speech possessed the texture of someone whose memory was not so much hazy as selectively pruned. He and Love returned to the archive room. Purbright approached Cabinet C, crouched, and slid the bottom drawer open. It glided smoothly. Miss Croom, watching anxiously, shook her head. It jammed before, she insisted. Something must have shifted. Perhaps, Purbright said, though he suspected jamming drawers were a universal feature of old furniture rather than evidence of conspiracy. He spent the next several minutes inspecting documents in the drawer, finding nothing abnormal: minutes, agendas, the occasional certificate of appreciation for volunteers. If there had ever been more illicit materials inside, they were now absent. If there was a file regarding Mr. Pease, Purbright said, it seems not to be here. Well, Miss Croom replied crisply, files do not wander off without assistance. Love, who had earlier been checking the labels on other cabinets, rejoined them. Sir, I noticed something. This drawer is marked as containing records from 84 to 89, but that memo looks older. Quite, Purbright said. Indeed, it appears to belong to a period earlier than any of these files. Miss Croom seemed delighted by this confirmation of disorder. Then it was placed wrongly, or placed here recently. Neither possibility is acceptable. Purbright straightened, brushing dust from his trousers. Miss Croom, would you happen to know anyone else who might remember Mr. Pease? Miss Croom considered. Perhaps Mrs. Glossop. She chairs the Commemorative History Committee and has been known to remember things other people have forgotten, sometimes cheerfully, sometimes less so. And Councillor Hibbert might know something. He rarely forgets matters related to parish finances. Purbright nodded. We'll speak with them. When they stepped outside, the churchyard lay subdued beneath a grey sky. A few daffodils wavered in the breeze, apparently uncertain whether they had emerged prematurely. Love looked at Purbright. Sir, do you think there's anything in this? Probably nothing serious, Purbright said, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. But people are rarely so careful about things that do not matter. They began the short walk back toward the station. At the gate, Purbright paused. Love, he said quietly, notice anything about that cabinet? Love thought for a moment. Looked normal to me. Precisely, Purbright replied. Too normal. Someone has taken the trouble to ensure there is nothing left in it that shouldn't be found. Love frowned. Do you think someone else knew Miss Croom found the memo? Purbright did not answer immediately. He gazed back at the parish hall where the last of the afternoon light glinted faintly on the windows. Let's just say, he murmured, that drawers rarely jam without reason, and even more rarely, unjam themselves. He resumed walking, the faintest crease of curiosity crossing his usually calm expression. A question, silent but unmistakable, began to form in his mind, and as he turned the corner, it followed him like a thin, persistent shadow. The parish newsletter appeared each fortnight with the punctuality of a well-trained but uninspired clerk. Its usual contents, announcements of bake sales, discreet complaints about parking near the church gate, and firm reminders about the library's overdue book policy, rarely provoked more than a passing glance. Yet this particular issue did something extraordinary. It elicited a frown from Inspector Purbright. He had picked it up idly from the station's front desk, intending only to skim it while waiting for Love to conclude a telephone call regarding a dispute over hedge boundaries. The newsletter, folded with habitual neatness, contained a leading editorial that struck Purbright as wandering perilously close to the rhetorical. Beneath the earnest title, Guardians of Our Shared Memory, the writer had extolled the value of accurate record-keeping and the dangers of selective forgetting. The prose, though diligently measured, carried a faint but distinct edge of pleading virtue. Purbright refolded the newsletter, tapping it gently against the desk. Love ended his call, judiciously brief, given the unpromising subject, and joined him. "Something interesting, sir?" Love asked. "Not exactly interesting," Purbright replied, "but perhaps relevant. The writer of this editorial appears to believe the parish is threatened by forgetfulness, and not the innocent kind." Love looked at the page without enthusiasm. "Do we know who wrote it?" "No signature," Purbright said, "which in a small community suggests ownership by everyone and no one simultaneously." Love accepted this as he accepted most of Purbright's remarks, with mild perplexity tinged by growing respect. The inspector set the newsletter down. "Let's see what Mrs. Glossop remembers about Mr. Pease," he said. "She is, after all, reputed to have the longest memory in Flaxwell, though some would say it is too sharply selective. Mrs. Edwina Glossop lived in a terrace of respectable, faintly dignified houses facing the cricket field. Her front garden, though meticulously trimmed, had the air of being under constant surveillance. The roses, in particular, seemed arranged as if on guard duty. She answered her door with the briskness of someone accustomed to shutting out the wind and any unsolicited information. "Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love, goodness, I hope nothing dreadful has happened," she said, clearly hoping to be reassured that nothing of the sort would inconvenience her afternoon. "Nothing of immediate concern," Purbright said. "We're simply making inquiries about parish records, in particular a Mr. Harold Pease." Mrs. Glossop blinked with polite astonishment. "Pease? Dear me, I haven't heard that name in years. Decades, I should think." "You have heard it, then?" Purbright said mildly. "Well, possibly," she conceded, leading them into a sitting room characterized by the faint scent of polished wood and an atmosphere which discouraged exuberant movement. "One meets so many people on committees, you know. Some make themselves memorable by accident rather than intention." Purbright smiled faintly. "And Mr. Pease? Which category would he fall into?" Mrs. Glossop lowered herself into an armchair positioned to confer maximum conversational advantage. "Hard to say. If he was on any committee, which I cannot confirm, he must have been rather quiet. I would certainly recall anything untoward." "Untoward in what sense?" Love asked. Mrs. Glossop looked at him with a faint expression suggesting that Sergeant Love belonged to a species inclined toward needless specificity. "In the sense that one remembers those who cause difficulty, Sergeant. A person who disrupts a meeting, speaks out of turn, questions minute details, or displays a need for accuracy beyond reason, always makes an impression." "And Mr. Pease made no such impression?" Purbright asked. "None whatsoever," she said, in a tone that implied the matter should now rest comfortably at her feet. "If he did attend meetings, he behaved in a manner so perfectly aligned with decorum that he disappeared entirely into it." Purbright studied her composed features. Mrs. Glossop had not achieved her position as chair of the Commemorative History Committee by yielding information too freely. Even so, her comments bore an unmistakable shape, the shape of evasion softened into courtesy. He tried another angle. "The parish newsletter printed an editorial today about the importance of remembering. It struck me as oddly emphatic. Would you happen to know who wrote it?" Mrs. Glossop's expression did not change, though her teacup paused momentarily in its ascent. "The editorials, Inspector, are drafted collectively by the Communications Subcommittee, of which I am merely one participant. It would be unseemly for any single hand to claim authorship." Purbright inclined his head. "Of course." Mrs. Glossop resumed her sip, her eyes drifting to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a parish fete from the late 1970s. She spoke with apparent casualness. "People do get fixated on the past. They convince themselves it contains answers to questions no one is asking." Purbright followed her gaze. In the photograph, he noted a blurred figure on the far right, ambiguous in shape, as though caught mid-movement or deliberately obscured. "Mrs. Glossop," he said quietly, "would you mind if I examined that photograph?" She hesitated for one fraction of a second, a brief, involuntary tightening of her hand around the teacup, but then rose. "If you think it useful, Inspector." Purbright came closer. The blurred figure, while indistinct, seemed separated from the cheerful cluster of fete-goers by a margin of physical and social distance. He did not comment on it. "Thank you," he said. "This may be nothing, but it is helpful." Mrs. Glossop smiled with carefully moderated warmth. "One hopes the past will oblige you by being clear, Inspector?" Purbright returned the photograph to its place. "The past is rarely clear, Mrs. Glossop, but it does have a habit of nudging its way forward." She made no reply. Back at the station, Purbright sat at his desk, the newsletter lying open beside him, Love perched on the edge of a filing cabinet in a posture he believed to be contemplative. "So Mrs. Glossop remembers nothing," Love summarized. "She remembers very selectively," Purbright corrected, "and she is determined that we, too, remember selectively." Love considered this. "Do you think she's hiding something?" Purbright shook his head lightly. "Not hiding, preserving. The distinction is important. Hiding implies fear. Preserving implies propriety." Love regarded him. "Same result, though, isn't it?" Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Often." He opened a folder of old council minutes, scanning the attendance lists. There was no mention of Harold Pease, yet the formatting suggested names had once been present and later removed. A faint indentation, the ghost of a typed word erased with some violent diligence, drew his eye. Love noticed his interest. "Something, sir?" "An absence," Purbright said, "which someone has gone to the trouble to tidy up." He closed the folder gently, as if not to disturb whatever shadows clung to its pages. "Love," he continued, "tomorrow we shall speak with Councillor Hibbett. He may be better acquainted with the structural habits of parish memory." Love nodded, though without conviction. "You think he'll be any more open than Mrs. Glossop?" "No," said Purbright blandly. "But he will be open in a different manner, which is sometimes as useful." He stood, stretching slightly. The station clock ticked with an officious enthusiasm inconsistent with the slow drift of the afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Purbright glanced once more at the parish newsletter. In the lower right-hand corner, where notices of youth choir rehearsals usually resided, a small boxed message read, "Corrections from previous issue have been omitted for clarity." Purbright's brow furrowed. He tapped the edge of the paper thoughtfully. "Love," he said very quietly, Do you recall any corrections in the previous issue? No, sir. Nor do I, Purbright murmured. He folded the newsletter and placed it in his coat pocket. The omission, he suspected, concealed something more troublesome than a misprint. A silence settled between the two men, thin, speculative, unobtrusive. But the inspector carried with him a new, delicate doubt that fluttered faintly at the edge of his thoughts, like a paper whose corner someone has recently disturbed, and it followed him out into the dusk. Flaxwell's parish hall, viewed in the pale light of morning, possessed an air of earnest propriety bordering on the devotional. Its stone facade, greyed by years of dutiful service, presented itself as a structure incapable of harbouring anything more scandalous than a misplaced hymn book. Yet, Inspector Purbright had come to regard such buildings with respectful caution. Institutions devoted to order, he believed, were often the most diligent at concealing its absence. He and Sergeant Love had arrived promptly at 10, summoned by Miss Evelyn Croom, who claimed to have discovered a visual material irregularity among the archive displays. Miss Croom greeted them with her characteristic blend of apology and righteous concern. "I felt it best to alert you, Inspector," she said. "One encounters disturbing things in the archive from time to time, but it is most unusual for such things to appear on the walls themselves." She led them toward a corridor of framed photographs documenting past fetes, garden shows, jumble sales, and the occasional commemorative tea. Purbright had walked this corridor many times before. Its images projected the illusion of a town serenely content with its own modest achievements. Miss Croom paused before a photograph dated Parish Fete, 1978. It was, at first glance, unremarkable. A cluster of villagers gathered near a makeshift bunting arch, frozen forever in agreeable smiles. The sun in the picture appeared brighter than Flaxwell's usual allowance. "I noticed something rather odd about this," she said. Purbright leaned in slightly. In the far right corner of the image stood a figure, separate from the cheerful crowd by just enough distance to imply ambivalence. His body shape was discernible, tallish, slightly stooped, hands clasped behind him, but his face was little more than a pale blur, not blurred by motion, blurred as though the camera lens had chosen intentionally not to commit his features to posterity. "Do we know who this gentleman is?" Purbright asked. Miss Croom drew herself up. "That, Inspector, is precisely the problem. I cannot identify him, and I can identify everyone else in every fate photograph of the last 20 years. Love, whose expertise in photographic analysis consisted chiefly of squinting, offered a tentative remark. "Could be the lighting, sir." "Lighting does not ordinarily erase faces," Miss Croom countered primly. Purbright observed the rest of the picture. The smiles of the other fete-goers seemed almost exaggerated, as though performing joy in the presence of a camera. Only the blurred man stood apart, unengaged. A minor detail, yet not an uninteresting one. "Have you noticed this before?" Purbright asked. "No," Miss Croom said, "and I check these displays frequently. I dust them every Thursday." She said this with the solemnity of one announcing a sacred ritual. Purbright studied the blurred figure again. "Could he be Mr. Pease?" Miss Croom hesitated. "I cannot say. I never met Mr. Pease myself." "Oh, but the timing," she folded her hands with a faint tremor of purpose, "is suggestive." "Suggestive of what?" Love asked. "Suggestive of someone who ought not to have been there," she replied. Purbright nodded slowly. They found Reverend Sanderson in the church garden supervising a reluctant clean-up of soggy hymn sheets left from the previous evening's rehearsal. He appeared only moderately distressed to be approached. "Ah, Inspector," he said, gathering his smile with pastoral diligence. "Is this about the drawers again?" "Not today," Purbright replied. "This is about a photograph." Sanderson's expression softened into cautious vagueness. Photographs are, of course, not always reliable records of truth. They capture a moment, but rarely its context. Purbright produced a small print he had made of the fate picture. "Do you recognize this man?" Sanderson peered at it. "Well, people do blur, Inspector, particularly when they are walking away." "He is not walking," Purbright said gently. No, perhaps not." The vicar cleared his throat. "But I confess I do not recognize him." "Would Mr. Pease have attended parish functions?" Sanderson smiled in the manner of a man attempting to speak delicately of someone whose social standing is unclear. Mr. Pease was not, shall we say, habitually present. He attended occasionally, I believe, though not always enthusiastically. "Do you recall him being at this particular fete?" Sanderson studied the photograph with exaggerated concentration. "I cannot speak with certainty. Many people came and went that year. It was the summer of the artisan cheese tasting. Crowds were unpredictable." Purbright returned the print to his pocket. "Thank you, Reverend." As they left, Sanderson called after him, "Inspector, might I suggest that dwelling too much on old photographs may lead to misinterpretations?" Purbright glanced back. "We shall be cautious." Sanderson nodded, though uneasily, and resumed directing the choir youths with a renewed sense of distraction. Their next call was to the parish office, where Councillor Hibbett sat in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and administrative ambition. His desk contained a perfectly symmetrical arrangement of papers, though none seemed to have been touched recently. "Inspector," Hibbett said, applying a proprietary tone to the title, "I understand you've been inquiring into historical matters, always perilous ground. People remember imperfectly." Purbright placed the fate photograph gently on the desk. "Do you know this man?" Hibbett adjusted his spectacles. "Possibly a visitor, or possibly someone not relevant." "Not relevant to what?" Purbright asked. "To the business of the fete, of course," Hibbett replied, with a dismissive flutter of his hand. "People wander into such events all the time." Purbright allowed silence to settle for a moment. He found silence more effective than interrogation. Eventually, Hibbett shifted in his seat. "Do you think," Purbright said mildly, "that this might be Mr. Pease?" Hibbett's reaction was unusually quick. "Pease? No, I shouldn't think so. He was, less presentable." "Presentable in what respect?" Love asked. "In every respect," Hibbett said with bureaucratic finality. Purbright examined him closely. Hibbett's practiced composure, usually as immovable as municipal stonework, had developed a barely perceptible fissure. Though small, it was enough to invite lingering doubt. "May I ask," Purbright said, "if you recall anything about the disappearance of Mr. Pease's records?" At this, Hibbett stiffened. "I recall nothing disappearing. If anything vanished, it was before my tenure, and any implication otherwise would be extremely unfortunate for community morale." "Community morale," Purbright repeated thoughtfully. "Yes," Hibbett said, straightening the edges of a paper, already straightened. "Matters from decades ago can only disrupt it." Purbright pocketed the photograph. "Thank you, Councillor." As they reached the hall, Hibbett called after them. "Photographs degrade, Inspector. It is unwise to place confidence in images that may be corrupted by time." Purbright replied without turning, "Time corrupts many things." Late afternoon found Purbright and Love in the archive room once again. The fate photographs lined the walls in chronological order. The 1978 frame hung slightly askew. Purbright reached out to adjust it, but paused. Someone else had already tried. He examined the frame carefully. A faint outline on the wall indicated that the photograph had been removed recently, within days perhaps. Perhaps even yesterday. "Love," Purbright said softly, "did you notice that?" Love leaned in. "Looks like it's been taken down." "Which suggests someone examined it," Purbright murmured, "and was dissatisfied with what they found." Miss Croom, hovering respectfully near the door, looked alarmed. "You mean someone tampered with it?" Purbright gave a non-committal hum. "Not tampered, considered." He studied the blurred figure again. In the otherwise cheerful tableau, The outline of the man now seemed more deliberate, less accident. Concealment, he thought, could be achieved not only by removing a face, but by never allowing it to register in the first place. "Miss Croom," Purbright asked, "did you ever see the original negative of this photograph?" "Years ago, perhaps," she said uncertainly. "But they were stored in a box that went missing during a reorganization. I assumed it was mislaid, but now—" Purbright walked slowly along the row of photographs, hands clasped behind him, mirroring unconsciously the blurred figure's stance. He returned to the fate image once more. "Love," he said quietly. "We must find that negative." "Do you think it'll still exist?" Love asked. "I think," Purbright said, "that it may exist precisely because someone hoped it wouldn't be looked for." He glanced around the archive room, at the carefully curated files, the impeccably labeled drawers, the walls that seemed excessively confident in their own order. Something in the space felt recently disturbed, but concealed beneath a veneer of tidiness. As they prepared to leave, a single detail caught Purbright's eye. A small scrap of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, lying just beneath the cabinet. He stooped and picked it up. It bore half a typed word, ease, torn from something larger. He folded the scrap delicately, placing it in his pocket. A trivial remnant, perhaps, or not trivial at all. Purbright straightened, gave the archive room a final contemplative look, and stepped into the corridor where the air seemed faintly heavier. Behind him, the blurred face in the photograph remained turned away, as if withholding a secret that the rest of Flaxwell had agreed, politely, dutifully, to forget. The inspector closed the door with quiet precision. A question, thin as the torn scrap in his pocket, trailed after him. The morning after his dispiriting visit to the Parish Archive found Inspector Purbright in his office, contemplating a stack of correspondence that had accumulated through the industry of those residents who believed a police inspector's principal duty was to acknowledge civic anxieties with prompt gratitude. The letters, 4 typed, 3 handwritten, and 1 produced with the faint, quivering strokes of a ballpoint pen whose owner had evidently refused spectacles on principle, concerned matters ranging from the unlicensed sale of goose eggs to the suspiciously brisk walking pace adopted by a new resident on Martingale Rise. None referred, at least directly, to the late Mr. Bletcham. Purbright read them all with the patient resignation of a man accustomed to the moral bookkeeping of respectable hamlets. When he had reached the end of the final sheet, he folded his hands behind his head and permitted himself the rare indulgence of thinking. The archive, its shredded registers, its time-tabled fussiness, its caretaker's defensiveness, had lodged in his mind like a pebble under a carpet, unseen yet undeniably present. The telephone rang with a tentativeness that suggested the caller considered interruption a mild impropriety. Constable Love's voice emerged, apologetic as usual. "Sir, Mrs. Malkin from the council office is here to see you. She says she assumed you would be expecting her." Experience had taught Purbright that when bureaucratic figures assumed he expected them, what they actually meant was that they could not bear the indignity of waiting. "Please do bring her in, love," he replied, tidily shuffling the letters into a drawer. Mrs. Malkin entered with the cautious purpose of a woman who moved through life as if each doorway might conceal an audit. She wore a neat cardigan of a shade too pale for authority, but too stiff for comfort, and she carried a canvas bag bulging with files whose labels suggested aggressive color coding. "Inspector Purbright," she said, inclining her head with the graciousness of one used to ceremonial handshakes at community lunches. "I understand you have been troubling yourself over the late Mr. Bletcham's status within our administrative records." "Troubling," Purbright echoed, "might be overstating matters. I have merely noted some irregularities." Mrs. Malkin sat, placing her bag on her knees protectively, as if fearful he might requisition it as evidence. "I felt I should clarify certain points," she began, "so that you need not trouble the archive staff further. They are conscientious, but I regret to say, rather easily agitated." Purbright nodded. "I gathered as much." Mrs. Malkin's lips compressed in sympathetic agreement. "Yes. Well, Mr. Bletcham's activities as parish clerk were, on the whole, competent. His record-keeping, however, not consistently so. He had a habit of shifting papers from one year to another when he felt the earlier period reflected poorly on the committee involved. Tidiness of reputation, you understand, rather more than tidiness of storage." "Indeed," said Purbright. He sensed the woman was preparing to produce a revelation, and waited with the patience of a fisherman who suspected his line was merely snagged on a weed. "You see," she continued, lowering her voice as if the filing cabinets might be informants, "I do not believe the archive staff are entirely aware of the number of alterations Mr. Bletcham made during his tenure. He was a scrupulous man, but his scruples were, how shall I put it, unorthodox. He disliked the appearance of parish discord, so he occasionally edited minutes in retrospect." She gave a genteel cough. "For harmony." Purbright let this rest between them. "Would you, by chance, have examples of such edits?" Mrs. Malkin's fingers tightened on her bag. "Yes," she said reluctantly, "and I fear they cast certain residents in a less flattering light, which is why Mr. Bletcham preferred they not be part of the formal record." Her gaze shifted under the pressure of some internal struggle. "I brought you a selection, purely for safeguarding transparency." She extracted a folder with the solemnity of unveiling relics. Inside were photocopies of minutes, margin annotations in an anxious slant, and a single original sheet bearing a crossing out so determined it had nearly torn through. Purbright examined them one by one. Several notations were trivial, alterations to meeting attendance, votes adjusted to imply unanimity, but others suggested friction quite at odds with the parish's fond portrait of itself. There was evidence of disputes over grant allocation, accusations of favoritism in allotment distribution, and, most intriguingly, a reference to the matter concerning the sealed envelopes, which had been struck through with grim enthusiasm. "Mrs. Malkin," he said, "would you happen to know what these envelopes contained?" "I could not say," she murmured, smoothing her skirt in a ritual of unease. "Mr. Bletcham handled them personally. He mentioned once that they were to do with, well, confidences entrusted to the parish office, matters of reputation." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Anonymous letters, then?" "I could not possibly speculate," Mrs. Biggs Malkin said, with the tone of one doing precisely that. He thanked her with care, for she was clearly exhausted by the moral weight of having said so much. She withdrew, leaving the office faintly perfumed with lavender and procedural anxiety. Purbright spent the next hour absorbing the documents. The late clerk, it seemed, had taken it upon himself to serve as a kind of reputational caretaker, a custodian of village appearances. There was something faintly tragic, yet faintly irritating about such a role. Those sealed envelopes intrigued him more than he cared to admit. He wondered how many grievances or indiscretions had been quietly diffused by that studious, shy man, and how many of them might now be floating, unmoored, in the community's conscience. His reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Malley, whose approach, heralded by firm footsteps, suggested cheerful immunity to subtle disturbance. "Sir," Malley announced, "Mrs. Worsfold is here. Says she won't take long. Says it's regarding Mr. Bletcham." "Send her in," Purbright replied. If the town meant to unburden itself of the dead clerk's legacy, he might as well be present to catch the pieces. Mrs. Worsfold entered without hesitation. Unlike Mrs. Malkin, she possessed no fear of official surroundings. She belonged to that energetic class of women who ran committees with a brisk generosity that brooked little disagreement. Her coat, though impeccable, conveyed an aura of having been hung for many seasons beside the rubber aprons of church fete volunteers. "Inspector," she said, seating herself before being invited, "I have come because rumours, as usual, are being permitted to flourish unchecked." This accusation was delivered with the air of a schoolmistress correcting a pupil's posture, though Purbright was fairly sure she had no children and had never taught. Still, the personality suited her. "Rumours concerning Mr. Bletcham, I assume?" Purbright asked mildly. "Concerning what he may have left behind," she clarified. "Some people, whose sense of discretion appears to be aspirational rather than achieved, are saying he held confidential material relating to parish matters. I wish to assure you that on behalf of the Ladies' Improvement Circle, we have absolutely nothing to conceal." "An admirable stance," Purbright said, "though I wonder what prompted such reassurance." Mrs. Worsfold's lips drew tight. "It is being said that Mr. Bletcham kept notes about everyone. That he collected little observations. Some are even claiming he kept a file on me." She folded her hands with the composed indignation of a duchess discovering her footman's diary. "I should like to know whether the police intend to validate such nonsense." Purbright regarded her thoughtfully. "Mr. Bletcham certainly maintained records," he said, choosing each word as carefully as if it might be quoted in the parish newsletter. "Their precise scope remains under examination. I would not say, however, that he intended mischief." "Mischief," Mrs. Worsfold sniffed, "is the work of idle people with cramped imaginations. Mr. Bletcham, whatever else he may have lacked, was not idle." There was a pause in which she seemed to reassess her remark for impropriety. She nodded once, firmly, having decided it met her standards. "If anything arises that concerns the circle," she added, with rehearsed magnanimity, "do let me know." She rose and departed without awaiting reply, her heels clicking with the decisiveness of a judge concluding proceedings. When she had gone, Purbright leaned back, considering the curious alignment between Mrs. Malkin's revelations and Mrs. Worsfold's anxieties. Both spoke of reputations, tidied, defended, feared. It occurred to him, with the gentle inevitability of a kettle beginning to simmer, that perhaps the parish mourned not so much the clerk himself as the quiet order he had imposed upon their social disarray. His musings were interrupted by Constable Love appearing in the doorway, holding a small brown paper parcel addressed to Parish Office for immediate sorting. It bore yesterday's postmark. "Sir," Love said, "this was delivered by mistake to the station. They thought it might be of interest." Purbright accepted it, turning it over in his hands. There was no sender's name, only a neat, cramped script and a faint scent of dust. Within lay a stack of folded papers, held together with a rubber band so brittle it threatened to crumble at touch. He removed the band with careful fingers. The first sheet was dated 3 months earlier. It bore the header "Confidential Parish Correspondence," and below it, in Mr. Bletcham's meticulous handwriting, a note, to be reviewed only in the event of inquiries. Purbright felt, rather than thought, the quiet shift in the atmosphere of his office. Somewhere in these pages, he sensed, lay the contours of a story the parish had politely suppressed, a story now edging, with impeccable manners, into the light. He turned the page. The documents discovered in the brown paper parcel lay on Purbright's desk, like an accusation too polite to voice its grievance. They were unremarkable in appearance, thin sheets yellowed only slightly at the edges, yet they possessed a gravity disproportionate to their modest weight. As he sorted them, the inspector discerned a pattern. Each sheet described, in Bletcham's prim lettering, small confessions or complaints entrusted to the parish office under the guise of civic concerns. Anonymous notes about garden boundaries, misreported bookkeeping, questionable committee expenses, and the occasional whisper of character faults. Alone they might appear petty, together they constructed a miniature map of the village's anxieties. It was shortly past 11 when he concluded his preliminary reading. The station, never a hive of activity, had reached its customary mid-morning stillness. Constable Love, having once again exhausted the possibilities of tidying the lobby notice board, had vanished into the back room with the defeated air of a man realizing that even tidiness can be a finite resource. Sergeant Malley was expected after lunch, assuming no emergency in the form of livestock escape demanded his attention. Purbright folded several of the more curious sheets into a pocket-sized file. One, in particular, concerned him, a letter dated early spring, referencing a circulation of envelopes intended to correct certain misapprehensions. It neither explained the misapprehensions nor named the intended recipients, nor did it clarify why Bletcham had chosen to retain the contents rather than distribute them. The inspector sensed that, in this matter, restraint had been more eloquent than disclosure. He fastened the file and stood, reconsidering his plan. He ought, he supposed, to revisit the parish office, though its inhabitants, particularly the skittish caretaker, possessed a remarkable capacity for nervous resistance. Still, some clarification was needed, and, inconveniently, the one individual likely to offer it was the Reverend Catamole. Purbright left the station, crossing the square at a pace that suggested neither urgency nor leisure. The village lay under a mild sunlight that lent the rooftops a faint cheeriness, which the inspector felt in no particular need of. He passed Mrs. Chitham's bakery, whose window display was once again dominated by seed cakes decorated in a manner that could only be described as staunch. A pair of parish committee members, recognizable by their officious nods, exchanged looks upon recognizing him, looks that betrayed the guilty curiosity of those who desperately wished to know something without appearing to seek it. The rectory, a Victorian building compelled into respectability by decades of annual repainting, stood with its front door half ajar. Purbright knocked lightly, unwilling to test whether the door's posture indicated openness or mere forgetfulness. A voice, from somewhere between the hallway and an adjacent room, called out a subdued invitation to enter. Reverend Catamole emerged in his shirt sleeves, his clerical collar tucked uncertainly under his arm, as though recently detached for reconsideration. His face wore the expression of a man whose day had begun several times, but had not yet properly settled into any of them. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "I was told you might come by." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "By whom?" "Oh," Catamole replied vaguely, "by the general sense of things." He motioned the inspector toward a sitting room containing mismatched chairs, an abundance of parish newsletters, and what appeared to be a half-sorted box of hymn sheets. "Tea?" the Reverend asked, not so much offering as inquiring whether Purbright might insist. "No, thank you," Purbright said. "I'm here about Mr. Bletcham." Catamole sighed, politely, as though apologizing for his own breath. "I feared as much." Purbright removed the folded sheet referencing the circulation of envelopes and set it on the table between them. "You are familiar with this?" The Reverend leaned forward. His eyes, normally diffident, narrowed with a caution that suggested both memory and regret. "Yes," he murmured. "I had rather hoped that matter would remain dormant." "Matters seldom remain so," Purbright observed. Catamole gave a small, defeated nod. "Mr. Bletcham felt," he began, choosing his phrasing like a man navigating a tight corridor, "that certain parish disagreements were escalating unnecessarily. He believed some members of various committees had begun to misrepresent one another's motives. He intended, I think, to remind the parties involved of their own conduct." "By means of envelopes containing written reflections?" Purbright asked. "Something of that nature." The Reverend adjusted his spectacles. He asked my opinion on whether such an intervention was wise. I, rather unhelpfully, I fear, told him that wisdom in such matters was rarely appreciated. Purbright let this rest. "Did Mr. Bletcham mention who the intended recipients were?" Catamole hesitated. "Only in general terms. He spoke of those who had allowed their differences to take on an uncharitable hue, which in this parish encompasses, I regret, a discouragingly wide field." The inspector allowed himself the faintest blink of amusement. "Do you know whether the envelopes were ever delivered?" The Reverend's pause was telling. "My understanding," he said slowly, "is that he changed his mind. He came to believe their delivery might worsen matters. Whether he destroyed them, I do not know. He said only that he would deal with them." "It is just possible that he meant concealment." A silence settled itself comfortably between the two men. Purbright considered the implications. Undistributed accusations, perhaps half-truths, perhaps wholly accurate observations, kept from their intended audience. Bletcham's death, orderly though it had been, had nonetheless disrupted a delicate balance. "Inspector," Cattermole continued, his voice dropping into a confidential register, "I do hope you understand that our parish is, well, sensitive. People have long memories and longer suspicions. If there is any way to resolve your inquiry without stirring ancient grievances, I should consider it a mercy." "I shall certainly endeavour to avoid unnecessary disturbance," Purbright replied, "though necessity is often a matter of perspective." As he rose to leave, the Reverend added, "If it isn't too impertinent, may I ask, are you expecting trouble?" Purbright offered the mildest of smiles. "Not expecting, Reverend, merely preparing for the possibility of its absence being temporary." He left the rectory with more certainty than he had entered it, though the certainty concerned only the complexity of the situation rather than any solution. In the square he paused. The breeze carried a faint scattering of church bells, merely practice strokes, but enough to imbue the village with an air of mild clerical chiding. A short walk brought him to the parish office. To his mild surprise, Miss Hargreaves, the caretaker's assistant, was manning the front desk. She looked up with that blend of apprehension and professional duty that suggested the inspector's presence simultaneously worried and flattered her. "Good morning, Miss Hargreaves," Purbright said. "Might I have a word with Mr. Tukes, if he is available?" Her hands fluttered like timid birds over the appointment ledger. "Oh, Inspector, Mr. Tukes is out just now. He went to fetch some, binding supplies. But he did leave this for you." She produced a sealed envelope, the sort used by offices that consider stapling too coarse an act, and handed it over with grave ceremony. Purbright thanked her and stepped aside to open it. Inside was a single typed note. "Inspector Purbright, if you are inquiring further into the matter of Mr. Bletcham's personal papers, I believe there is something you ought to see. Please return when the office is quiet. Tukes." The tone was humble but urgent, as though the writer anticipated reproach for taking initiative. It bore none of the defensive fussiness of the caretaker's previous manner. Something, evidently, had unsettled him. Purbright folded the note, feeling the subtle sting of anticipation. Whatever Tukes had discovered, or imagined he had discovered, it had been important enough to overcome his natural aversion to involvement. He left the parish office and walked in the direction of the station, allowing the village's gentle rhythm to lull him into reflection. He had reached the churchyard gate when he noticed, beneath the yew tree, a small figure hunched with industrious purpose. Mrs. Penworthy, unofficial chronicler of every birth, marriage, feud, and communion biscuit mishap, was adjusting a bouquet on one of the newer graves. She glanced up as Purbright passed, offering a nod too swift to be friendly. The inspector slowed. Something about the bouquet caught his attention, not the flowers themselves, but a folded slip of paper tucked discreetly beneath the ribbon. Mrs. Penworthy saw his glance and tightened her lips. "Just a little message," she said. "Private family matters." "Of course," Purbright replied with polite neutrality, though he noted, not without interest, that the grave belonged not to any family of hers, but to a parishioner who had died without close kin. The woman hurried away, leaving the inspector to consider the slip of paper he had not taken, but could not forget. The village, it seemed, had adopted the habit of leaving notes, some in envelopes, some not, at the feet of the dead as well as the living. He resumed his walk, his mind moving with the unhurried precision of a man assembling a puzzle, one indistinguishable piece at a time. By the time he reached the station door, he understood only this much. Mr. Tukes had something to reveal, Mrs. Penworthy had something to hide, and Mr. Bletcham, in his quiet way, had been gathering far more than minutes of meetings. And as Purbright entered his office, he found himself asking, though no one was present to hear it, whether the dead clerk had kept secrets merely to preserve harmony, or whether he had intended at some future moment to disturb it entirely. Inspector Purbright had become accustomed to receiving notes whose urgency was more imagined than real. Yet Mr. Tukes's typed message, with its tremulous undertone of procedural panic, had lodged itself in the inspector's mind all evening. By morning, curiosity, rather than concern, drew him once again toward the parish office. It was earlier than most clerical staff preferred to acknowledge, and the square lay in that expectant hush which occurs when shop blinds are still half lowered and conversation feels impolite. The parish office door yielded with a reluctant squeak. Inside, the usual faint scent of dust and administrative anxiety greeted him. Mr. Tukes, thin as a boundary marker and just as stiff, appeared at once from an inner room. His hands were clasped before him with the reverence of one presenting an apology to a superior deity. "Inspector Purbright, thank you for coming so promptly," he said, with a formality suggesting he had rehearsed the greeting several times already. "I gathered you had something to discuss," Purbright replied mildly. Yes, indeed, though I should clarify that I am acting solely from a sense of duty to correct the record." Tukes led the inspector toward the cramped archive workroom, closing the door behind them, though the building was practically empty. The caretaker's nervousness, always pronounced, now verged on existential. He wrung his hands as if attempting to extract from them the precise words he would need. At last, he retrieved a cardboard box from beneath a stack of parish newsletters. Its lid bore a label, once neatly printed, but now scribbled over many times in pencil. "Mr. Bletcham kept this," Tukes said, setting it before the inspector. "It was stored with the misfiled annual minutes. I discovered it late yesterday." Purbright regarded the box with polite interest. "And what is in it?" Tukes inhaled sharply. "Drafts, Inspector. Drafts of letters written in Mr. Bletcham's hand, but—" He paused, lowering his voice even though they were quite alone. "But not sent." Purbright lifted the lid. Within lay a collection of narrow envelopes, each containing a single sheet. They were unsealed, as if awaiting some final decision that had never come. He removed one at random. The letter, addressed to the chairwoman of the Ladies' Improvement Circle, began with elaborate courtesy. Its tone, however, was unmistakably corrective. It politely disputed her claim to have personally financed certain horticultural improvements, noting that committee funds, quietly diverted from an unrelated budget, had supplied the bulk. The draft ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though Bletcham had feared that finishing it might violate both his conscience and his desire for domestic calm within the parish. Purbright replaced it and examined a second. This one, addressed to the treasurer of the Allotment Society, questioned the accuracy of his receipts for fencing repairs. The inspector recognized the treasurer's name. He had a reputation for frugality so severe that he could extend a tin of paint beyond its natural limit. Purbright suspected the repair costs, if indeed inflated, had been inflated only modestly. But modest misrepresentations can be more dangerous to reputation than bold ones. He slid the letters back into their place. "You've done the proper thing, Tukes," he said. "When did you last see this box?" "Oh, never before," the caretaker said quickly. "I mean, I may have observed it, but not recognized its significance. Mr. Bletcham was private in his arrangements. Would you say he intended to send these letters?" Tukes winced. "I should rather think not, sir. They were drafts. He often drafted things he never posted. He said it helped him clarify matters." Purbright detected the faintest quiver of loyalty in the man's voice. "Quite so," he murmured. "Did he ever speak to you about the envelopes he prepared for circulation?" The caretaker blanched. "I had rather hoped you would not raise that matter." "Nevertheless," Purbright said gently, "I must." Tukes's shoulders sagged under the weight of a confession he was evidently unwilling to grant fully. "I knew of their existence, Inspector. He showed them to me one evening, asking whether I thought they might be helpful. I told him that helpfulness is often unwelcome when attached to truth." Purbright allowed himself a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. "Wise advice." "I didn't mean it to be wise," Tukes muttered. "Just safe." Purbright examined the box once more. "Is this everything?" The caretaker hesitated, fatally, as far as Purbright's suspicions were concerned. "I believe so," he said, his tone far too practiced. The inspector's gaze drifted to the shelves behind him. One drawer bore a label that had been peeled off recently, its adhesive residue still shiny. Another, marked obsolete forms, seemed too neatly arranged to be obsolete at all. But Purbright made no comment. He merely closed the box with deliberate gentleness. "Thank you, Mr. Tukes. You've been very helpful." The caretaker flinched, interpreting the compliment as an accusation. I shall continue to tidy the files, Inspector. If I discover anything else—" "I trust you'll let me know," Purbright said. He left the office in the same unhurried manner with which he had entered. Yet outside, he paused at the foot of the building's narrow steps. There was something, not a fact, merely a feeling, that the caretaker had withheld. Not out of malice, perhaps, but from a terror of being seen as connected to other people's troubles. The sky had clouded slightly, as though the day had become uncertain of its ambitions. Purbright turned toward the High Street, where Mrs. Penworthy could often be found collecting observations for her unofficial chronicles of civic morality. Finding her had become a matter of routine inevitability. She appeared wherever murmurs formed. Sure enough, she stood at the bus stop, even though she was not waiting for the bus. She pretended to consult a timetable whose pages she had long since memorized. "Mrs. Penworthy?" Purbright said with a cordial nod. "Oh," she replied, with the modest astonishment of someone caught in the act of minding others' affairs. "Inspector, how unexpectedly punctual of you." "I don't believe I announced an appointment." "Precisely," she said, as if confirming her own insight. He paused, adjusting his tempo to her preference for conversational ambush. "I gather you visited the churchyard yesterday," he said casually. Her chin rose. "I try to keep the graves tidy. The rectory cannot manage everything." "Yes," Purbright said, "I noticed your attentiveness. A good many of the deceased must value your stewardship." "Well," she said primly, "I should hope so." "Did you know Mr. Bletcham well?" Purbright asked. She sniffed. "As one knows anyone who never attends anything yet records everything." An intriguing phrasing, though said with the offence of someone perplexed by the dead man's restraint. "Did he ever mention his confidential correspondence?" Mrs. Penworthy blinked, attempting to mask interest with a front. "If he kept secrets, Inspector, they were not shared with me, and I cannot imagine why you would think otherwise." "I didn't say I thought otherwise." She opened her mouth to deliver a retort, but no retort arrived. Instead, she pressed her lips together, then glanced, not subtly, toward the churchyard, where the yew tree stood like a quiet observer. "I have noticed," she said finally, "that certain people miss Mr. Bletcham rather less than they claim to." "Indeed?" "Yes. Absence," she continued with chilly dignity, "can be very revealing." Before Purbright could ask her to elaborate, she executed a firm nod of farewell and walked off, leaving behind a faint smell of lavender and moral vigilance. The inspector resumed his walk toward the station. He had almost reached the corner when he saw, approaching him with purposeful delicacy, Mrs. Worsfold of the Ladies' Improvement Circle. Her expression was one of well-directed indignation. "Inspector Purbright," she said, "I must protest. My committee has been subjected to quite unnecessary speculation. Someone anonymous, of course, has been spreading the notion that our accounts will soon be under scrutiny." Purbright waited. "This," she continued, "is intolerable. We pride ourselves on transparency." "As far as is convenient," Purbright suggested in a tone of gentle observation. Mrs. Worsfold straightened. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," Purbright replied pleasantly. "Only an observation drawn from committee minutes." She regarded him with a mixture of alarm and injured self-regard. "If you have obtained documents, drafts or otherwise, that mention my committee, I should be informed." Should you? She stiffened. Inspector, reputations are delicate. They must be handled with due care. I quite agree. But the conversation went no further. Mrs. Worsfold, suddenly aware of how much or how little she had revealed, excused herself with a curt bow of her head and hurried away, her indignation rising like steam behind her. Purbright entered the station with a calmness that belied the steady sharpening of his thoughts. He placed Tukes's box on his desk, then sat. The room felt very quiet. He removed one letter and read again the line Bletcham had drafted. Certain misapprehensions must be corrected before they become harmful. The inspector considered the phrasing. Harmful to whom? The parish? Its committees? Or, unexpectedly, to Bletcham himself? The question seemed delicate, but persistent. He replaced the letter and shut the box. Then, quite suddenly, he noticed something he had not observed before. A faint, blocky indentation on the underside of the lid, as though something rectangular had once been taped there and later removed. A missing item, absent from an already secret collection. Purbright sat back in his chair, the silence in the room subtly shifting around him. Someone else, he now suspected, had been through the box before he arrived. Inspector Purbright had formed the habit of taking his morning tea at Mrs. Cribwell's tea shop whenever administrative burdens permitted. The establishment, a narrow-fronted relic on the high street, prided itself on cakes so modest that even the vicar felt comfortable eating too. The inspector relied on its unassuming quiet. Conversations here tended to be discreetly audible rather than aggressively volunteered. On this particular morning, the atmosphere was subdued, even by the tea shop's usual standards. The bell above the door tinkled politely as Purbright entered, prompting Mrs. Cribwell herself to appear from behind a lace-curtained partition. "Inspector," she said, with the solemnity of one greeting an ecclesiastical official, "your usual table is free." He murmured his thanks and seated himself near the window, where the view of the high street allowed him to monitor the slow drift of local gossip in its natural habitat. The pavement. Mrs. Cribwell returned with a teapot and a plate containing what she declared to be a light sponge, though its density suggested a geological formation more than a confection. Purbright accepted it without comment, remarking upon the cake's structural integrity would only wound her gentle pride. He had scarcely poured his tea when the door chimed again. Mr. and Mrs. Allaby entered, he a man of acceptable prosperity and unacceptable conversational stamina, she a nervous wisp of respectability whose eyes darted as if mapping potential embarrassments. The couple spotted Purbright at once. Mrs. Allaby offered a polite bow of the head. Mr. Allaby, however, marched directly to the inspector's table. "Inspector Purbright," he announced, as if addressing a small assembly rather than one man and a teapot. "I trust we are not intruding?" Purbright gestured to the empty chairs. "Not in the least." Mrs. Allaby settled herself with cautious delicacy. "We had hoped to speak with you briefly," she said. "In confidence." The inspector doubted their definition of confidence aligned with the common one, but he maintained his pleasant demeanour. Mr. Allaby cleared his throat, the sound carrying an air of impending proclamation. "I understand," he leaned forward, "that the late Mr. Bletcham kept certain papers." Purbright lifted his cup with unhurried grace. "He kept many things. The parish office is a trove." "Yes, yes," Allaby said, "but these particular papers, well, rumours have reached us suggesting they might contain references to several parish committees." "Rumours do travel efficiently in Flaxborough," Purbright said, "faster than buses in many cases." Mrs. Allaby's hands pressed together tightly. "We merely worry," she said, "that misunderstandings might arise." "Mistakes in record-keeping," her husband added, "are easily magnified by those seeking to find trouble where none exists." Purbright suspected the Allaby's concern was less about misunderstandings and more about the possibility of precise, accurate recollections becoming public. "I have not found anything yet that requires alarm," he said. The couple looked relieved. and immediately more anxious, as if embarrassed, have hoped so obviously. Mr. Allaby coughed again. "I should mention, Inspector, that my wife has always taken a keen interest in maintaining the parish's reputation. It would distress her, and naturally me, if the community were to draw unflattering conclusions from incomplete information." "I assure you," Purbright said, "no conclusions have yet been drawn." Mrs. Allaby's shoulders relaxed by a precise half-centimetre. "We are grateful," she said. "Truly." They departed soon after, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and marital self-consciousness. Purbright watched them through the window, Mrs. Allaby walking a fraction ahead, Mr. Allaby adjusting his pace to match a shorter stride he considered dignified. Their visit, though lacking substance, had sharpened Purbright's sense that multiple parties were beginning to fear the contents of a dead man's drafts more than the fact of his death. He finished his tea, left exact change, and stepped back onto the high street. A bus had just arrived, its passengers dispersing with the awkwardness of people uncertain whether their destinations justified their journeys. Among them was Miss Groteley, the secretary of the Allotment Society. She spotted the inspector with an expression suggesting she had almost expected to find him waiting for her. "Inspector Purbright," she called, hurrying toward him. "I must trouble you for a moment." Purbright suppressed a sigh. He sensed the beginning of a pattern. "Certainly, Miss Groteley." She paused to catch her breath. "I have been informed, anonymously, I might add, that certain accounts are being examined." Purbright kept his expression blankly agreeable. "Are they?" "Well," Miss Groteley reddened, "I did wonder if it might relate to the fencing repairs. I recall that Mr. Bletcham had some query regarding them." "Only a draft query," Purbright said, "not a formal one. That is a relief." But her tone belied her words. She seemed less relieved than irritated by the uncertainty of how much or how little the inspector might know. "Of course," she added with forced brightness, "all receipts are entirely in order." "Entirely?" Purbright echoed softly. She faltered. "Well, yes, insofar as anyone can recall the precise cost of staples and boards 4 months after the fact. I imagine most treasurers keep records." Yes, one does one's best." She swallowed. "You won't, publish anything, will you?" "I am not in the habit of publishing," Purbright said, "and the police do not issue newsletters." "Oh, no, of course not." She laughed, a brittle sound, then waved a flustered farewell and hurried down the street, as though chased by her own conscience. Purbright walked toward the station at a leisurely pace. The clouds overhead had gathered into the kind of muted grey that promised neither rain nor improvement. As he passed the churchyard gate, he noticed the rector, Reverend Broxby, supervising a volunteer who was trimming the yew hedge with great ceremony but little accuracy. "Inspector," Reverend Broxby called, stepping forward. His clerical collar was slightly crooked, lending him an air of someone accidentally ordained. "Good morning, Rector." "I wonder if I might trouble you for a word." Broxby cast a doubtful glance at the volunteer hedge trimmer, who appeared to be shaping the hedge into something both theological and unintentional. "Privately." Purbright waited. "It concerns Mr. Bletcham," Broxby said with a sigh cultivated over many months. "I fear his death has stirred anxieties among certain parishioners." "I've observed that," Purbright said. "Yes, well, one tries to encourage Christian forbearance, but some individuals become rather protective of their reputations, ridiculously so, as if anyone in Flaxborough possesses a reputation sturdy enough to withstand investigation." He shook his head sorrowfully, though a small gleam in his eye suggested he rather enjoyed the irony. "Did Mr. Bletcham confide in you?" the inspector asked. "Confide?" Broxby chuckled without humour. "No. Bletcham had the air of a man who took notes on other people's confessions, not one inclined to offer his own." "Did he ever mention draft letters he had written?" "Draft letters?" Broxby frowned. He wrote many drafts. I assumed they were all thwarted complaints. Thwarted by whom? Broxby hesitated. Conscience, perhaps, or fear of appearing disagreeable. Fear of appearing disagreeable, Purbright repeated mildly, is responsible for many quiet revolutions in Flaxborough. Indeed. The rector sighed again, this time with genuine weariness. A small town is a delicate ecosystem, Inspector. Remove one irritant and another springs up before you can appreciate the improvement. I'll bear that in mind. Broxby gave a faint nod and returned to his hedge trimmer, who was now creating an unexpected arch in the shape of a lopsided fish. Purbright left them to it. Back at the station, he found Sergeant Malley engaged in the noble art of appearing industrious while doing nothing. Malley sat upright as the inspector entered. "Any updates, sir?" Malley asked. "Only that the entire parish seems determined to inquire what I do or do not know," Purbright said. "Suspicious lot. Self-conscious, rather." He retrieved the cardboard box from his desk drawer and opened it again. The indentation inside the lid remained, stubbornly suggestive of something once taped there. It was shaped like a small notebook, or perhaps a narrow envelope. Purbright studied the space for a long moment. Then, with the care of a man folding his thoughts into small compartments, he lifted the draft letters again. Each sheet was neatly typed, each envelope bearing Bletcham's precise handwriting. Yet none of them seemed connected to the missing item. He thought briefly of Mr. and Mrs. Allaby, of Miss Groteley, of Mrs. Worsfold, of all the people whose discomfort seemed inversely proportional to their innocence. He replaced the lid. As he did so, his eye caught something faint along the box's bottom edge, a thread, almost invisible, lodged beneath a flap of glued cardboard. Purbright lifted it with a fingernail. It emerged reluctantly, a short fibre of dark blue wool, a peculiar find, given that Bletcham had been known for wearing beige cardigans exclusively. Purbright held the wool between his fingers, turning it so that the sunlight glinted against its texture. Someone else, he now suspected, had not merely rifled the box, but done so wearing a garment that Bletcham himself would never have owned. The question, subtle as a sigh, hung in the quiet room. Whose sleeve had brushed the inside of the dead man's box? Inspector Purbright had learned that the surest way to disturb an otherwise contented parish was not by revealing a scandal, but by declining to deny one. His reluctance to provide updates, real or fabricated, now produced a faint but persistent tremor of communal unease. Even the lampposts, he thought, seemed to lean conspiratorially toward one another as he made his way to the county records office the following morning. The records office occupied a building of unimpressive stature but exaggerated decorum. It was overseen by Miss Tesseline Broom, a woman whose manner conveyed that paper, properly filed, was humanity's final defense against chaos. She greeted Purbright with the stiff acceptance one reserves for professional inconvenience. "Inspector Purbright," she said, "your letter indicated a wish to examine past parish inventories. I trust the request is not indefinite?" "Only a morning's worth," Purbright said, "unless the documents prove unusually entertaining." Miss Broom did not consider this a satisfactory jest. "We do not encourage entertainment here," she replied, "but you are welcome to the reference desk." She led him to a narrow table, flanked by cabinets that stood like disapproving elders assessing a candidate for marriage. Purbright thanked her and began reviewing the inventory logs. Bletcham's most recent entry appeared neat, unsurprising, and entirely free of the improvisations that sometimes crept into parish documentation when committee members attempted mathematics without supervision. Yet Purbright found something that caused him to pause, a notation in the margin, very small, almost deliberately unobtrusive, a penciled Q circled once. He checked the preceding entries. None carried such a mark. The Q appeared only on the final page, dated 3 days before Bletcham's death. Miss Broom returned, carrying a reluctant pot of tea that looked as though it had been brewed during a period of national austerity. "You have found what you required?" "I've found something," he said. She peered at the margin. Oh, that. Mr. Bletcham had a habit of marking documents for questioning with a Q. He disliked ambiguity. So do we all? Purbright murmured. Miss Broom tapped the page with prim irritation. If you intended to examine that particular item, she said, I should note that one related file is missing. Purbright lifted his eyes. Missing? A purely administrative misplacement, she said quickly. I assure you, it is not uncommon. How long misplaced? She stiffened. 2 days? And coincidentally, Purbright said, 2 days after Mr. Bletcham's death. Miss Broom arranged her expression so that it displayed neutrality while broadcasting offence. Inspector, our indexing system is not subject to coincidence, merely to human fallibility. That is oddly reassuring, Purbright said. She withdrew in a state of classical disapproval, leaving Purbright alone with his thoughts and the faintly sour tea. The missing file, the penciled Q, and the blue wool thread he had found in Bletcham's box formed the beginnings of a constellation, still faint, but unmistakably composed of points meant to connect. Purbright gathered his notes, thanked Miss Broom with a courtesy that deepened her discomfort, and stepped outside into the cool sunlight. He found himself walking toward the Flaxborough Handweavers Guild, an organization whose public devotion to craft belied its private devotion to committee intrigue. If blue wool had shed from someone rifling through Bletcham's effects, the probability that it originated from a handweaver's garment seemed uncomfortably plausible. The guild hall was housed in a repurposed bakery whose ovens had not produced bread since the 1920s, but still contributed a scent vaguely suggestive of scorched rye. A handwritten sign on the door declared, "Work in progress, enter softly." Purbright obeyed its instruction. Inside he discovered 4 women seated around looms that clacked with the faint menace of bureaucratic stamping machines. Mrs. Eastrop, the guild's chairwoman, looked up with the kind of cordial surprise one reserves for visiting clergy or unexpected in-laws. "Inspector Purbright," she said, "this is a pleasure of the strictly non-criminal variety, I hope." "A pleasure of information," he said. She indicated a wooden stool that looked as though it had once been used to discipline apprentices. "Do sit." Purbright sat. Mrs. Eastrop resumed her weaving. "We had wondered, Inspector, whether the guild might be invited to contribute a memorial textile for Mr. Bletcham's service, a runner for the lectern, perhaps." "Something sober." "A thoughtful idea," Purbright said. "Blue wool, perhaps." 3 of the women froze. One continued weaving, but noticeably faster. Mrs. Eastrop resumed movements of impeccable calm. "Blue is popular, of course," she said. "It conveys restraint. One rarely goes wrong with restraint." "I ask," Purbright said mildly, "because I encountered a thread of such wool recently, near some of Mr. Bletcham's papers." This statement produced a silence that extended itself like someone looking for an escape route. Mrs. Eastrop cleared her throat. "Many people in Flaxborough wear blue," she said. "I dare say some of us even wear it to meetings where we are least expected." "A fortunate fashion," Purbright said. "Consistency simplifies matters." The woman who had continued weaving, Miss Wickle, if memory served, now spoke without looking up. "We heard," she said quietly, "that Mr. Bletcham intended to raise some procedural concerns at the next parish review." Mrs. Eastrop shot her a warning glance. Miss Wickle ignored it. "For instance," Miss Wickle continued, "committee members signing off on expenditures without formally reviewing them." Mrs. Eastrop's loom clacked with a decisiveness that implied imminent censure. "Idle rumours, Inspector," she said tightly. "A man in Mr. Bletcham's position hears many complaints and drafts too many letters. Without guidance, such drafts can be misunderstood." "Misunderstood," Purbright said, "or intercepted." Mrs. Eastrop's jaw set. "If you have any genuine inquiries, Inspector, the Guild will cooperate fully, but speculation does not fall within our charter." Purbright rose politely. "Thank you. I shall return if I require clarification." As he reached the door, he heard Miss Wickle say, in a tone of resigned mischief, "He'll be back." Outside, the air felt cooler, as if the Guildhall had been hoarding warmth for its looms. Purbright walked back toward the centre of town, reflecting on the increasing quantity of people who seemed nervously interested in what Bletcham had or had not intended to reveal. He was passing the post office when someone called his name. Mrs. Greetham, the parish newsletter editor, a role of quiet omnipotence, hurried across the pavement. "Inspector," she said breathlessly, "I was about to deliver the next issue, but I wondered whether you might review a draft paragraph." "About?" "The late Mr. Bletcham." She produced a folded sheet from her handbag. "I've written a short tribute." "Very short? Purposely vague?" Purbright unfolded the paper. The tribute consisted of 3 sentences, 2 of which appeared to have been composed in a rush to avoid potential libel. "I hesitate," Mrs. Greetham said, wringing her gloves, "to include anything that might be read as suggestive. The parish is prone to reading suggestions where none exist." "A wise precaution," Purbright said, handing back the sheet. "But you may remove the 3rd sentence." Her cheeks coloured. "Ah, yes, I suspected as much." "It sounded," she lowered her voice, "a bit too interpretive." "It did." She exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Inspector. One strives to maintain neutrality." "Neutrality," Purbright said, "is seldom neutral in Flaxborough." Mrs. Greetham blinked at this, uncertain whether she had been advised or warned, then retreated toward the post office with the tension of one carrying an unexploded editorial device. Purbright continued toward the station. Inside, Sergeant Malley was filling a kettle with the care of a man hoping good tea might grant him a promotion. He straightened when Purbright entered. "Anything new, sir?" "Only confirmations of what we already suspected," Purbright said. "Fear is a diligent correspondent." Malley nodded without understanding. The inspector returned to his desk and set down his notes. The blue thread lay folded between 2 sheets of paper, its colour muted but persistent. He considered, not for the first time, how a small piece of wool might acquire significance in a case where nothing overtly criminal had yet declared itself. He took up a magnifying glass. The fibre had a faint twist, finer than the practical yarns sold in the shops. A hand-dyed thread, most likely. He thought of the looms in the Guildhall, of Miss Wickle's unprompted remark, of Mrs. Eastrop's caution. Setting the thread aside, he opened Bletcham's draft letters again. On the 2nd page of a half-finished memorandum, he noticed something he had not examined closely before, a faint smudge in the lower right margin, not ink nor pencil, a blur, as though someone's sleeve, loosely woven soft, had brushed across the paper. He held the page to the light. The smudge was blue, not identical to the thread, but close enough to suggest a shared ancestry. Purbright placed the page carefully on his desk. The office, quiet as a held breath, seemed to adjust its weight around the discovery. Someone, sometime in the day or 2 before, or after, Bletcham's death, had handled these papers with a familiarity that implied intent. The question that entered Purbright's mind, discreetly but firmly, was this: had they handled the documents before Bletcham himself had finished writing them? The morning after the incident at the vicarage arrived with an air of strained propriety, as though the town itself had rehearsed the routine politeness expected of it, but could not quite commit to the performance. Windows were opened, but only part way. Curtains twitched, but seldom long enough to reveal a whole face. Even the sparrows, ordinarily inclined to vulgar enthusiasm in their dawn announcements, chirped with a certain reserve, as if unwilling to draw attention to themselves at so delicate an hour. Inspector Purbright, who had slept tolerably well, though not so well as he had claimed to the sergeant, felt the familiar prickle of incompleteness that attends an investigation in which no one has yet contradicted himself to a satisfying degree. He set off toward the estate of Mrs. Audley Foxwell, a woman renowned for her opinions, her roses, and her elaborate system of social ranking in which she alone served as arbiter. If anything untoward occurred in the parish, malicious or merely incompetent. Mrs. Foxwell was generally aware of it 10 minutes before anybody else. She received the inspector in the morning room, a chamber decorated so thoroughly in shades of yellow that a lesser man might have blinked. Purbright, having trained for years in the endurance of civilian decor, merely inclined his head in greeting. "My dear Inspector, you arrive at a moment of dreadful inconvenience," she said, motioning him toward a chair that appeared more fragile than necessary. "The gardener has taken ill, quite suddenly and suspiciously, if you ask me, and I am left with the roses in a state of moral abandonment." Purbright seated himself gently. "I am sorry to hear it, madam, though I confess I am here on another matter." "Yes, the business of poor Mr. Latchford," she said, lowering herself with care into a matching but marginally sturdier chair. "Though poor may be a charitable exaggeration, he was not universally adored. I believe I may say that without overstepping." "Universal affection is a rare distinction," Purbright replied. "Indeed, and rarer still in a parish committee treasurer." "The species is not bred for popularity?" She folded her hands with the pronounced elegance of someone who wished it to be noted. Purbright adopted an expression that encouraged recollection. "You were present at the meeting the evening before Mr. Latchford's passing?" "Only in the sense that I was physically among the others," she said. "Mentally, I drifted. One does with those minutes. A certain monotony sets in after the first 3 pages. You may nevertheless have observed something of interest." "Well," she said, her gaze drifting to the window, as though the roses might provide inspiration. "If one defines interest broadly, there was a peculiar exchange between Mr. Latchford and the vicar. The latter appeared to approach him with some document, an envelope, I believe, but Mr. Latchford refused it. Rather stiffly, if I may say so." Stiffness was his default setting, of course, but this seemed excessive even for him. Purbright made a mental note. Did either of them speak loudly enough to be overheard? Only the vicar. Mr. Pennington spoke in that resigned way he has when undertaking civic duties. Something about it cannot simply be overlooked, a phrase which, I think you will agree, can mean far more or far less than it appears to. And Mr. Latchford? Merely glowered. The man had 3 varieties of glower, and all were designed to discourage follow-up questions. The inspector nodded slowly. "And after the meeting?" "Ah." Mrs. Foxwell leaned forward by the smallest and most controlled margin. "Here, Inspector, matters take on the aroma of impropriety. I happened to remain behind. An old friend had mislaid her gloves, and I felt morally obliged to assist, and thus I observed Mr. Latchford exiting the hall by the east door with considerable haste." Haste? A briskness verging on indignation, and he was not alone. Purbright waited. "He was joined by Miss Harriet Dowsett," she said, savouring the disclosure as though it were a particularly well-aged cheese. "A woman whose ability to involve herself in other people's business has been remarked upon by many, though perhaps not loudly enough." This, Purbright reflected, was typical of Mrs. Foxwell's intelligence, generous in detail, wary in implication, and invariably laced with the mild venom of social correction. "You believe their meeting was arranged?" "I believe nothing," she said, with the air of someone who believed several things quite firmly. "I merely note that Miss Dowsett had no obvious reason to be leaving by the east door. Her bicycle is kept on the opposite side of the hall, and though I would not accuse her of mechanical incompetence, I doubt she would carry it around the building for pleasure." Purbright offered a courteous inclination of the head. "Your recollection is most helpful." Mrs. Foxwell permitted herself a faint, pleased smile. "If my modest observations bring clarity to this unpleasant affair, then at least the morning will not be entirely wasted." After a few additional formalities, Purbright excused himself and left the yellow room with a sense of muted accomplishment. Unsupported suspicion was, after all, a commodity of unpredictable value. One never knew when it would appreciate. The inspector walked from the Foxwell estate toward the village green. The day had grown brighter, though not invitingly so. The sky possessed that washed-out quality characteristic of weather that has no intention of improving further. As he passed the post office, he noted the presence of Miss Harriet Dowsett herself, engaged in what looked very much like browsing, but appeared, upon closer inspection, to be an attempt to overhear a dispute between two patrons over the late delivery of a parcel. Purbright approached with the gentle inevitability of a tax document. "Miss Dowsett?" She turned, affecting surprise with a skill that bordered on professional. "Inspector, goodness, I hardly noticed you." "It is a common experience," he said mildly. "Might I impose on your time for a brief conversation?" "Of course, though I am afraid the morning is already something of a scramble. There is a bake sale to arrange, and Mrs. Pennington insists on altering the tablecloth colours at the last possible moment." "I will attempt not to contribute to the chaos," Purbright said. She gave a thin smile. "One does one's best. What is it you wish to ask?" The inspector glanced toward the quieter portion of the square. "Perhaps a short walk will offer us more privacy." They strolled at a pace neither leisurely nor hurried, a compromise that suited them both. When they reached the oak tree at the centre of the green, Purbright spoke. "You attended the parish committee meeting 2 nights ago." "I did, though I am not technically a committee member, as I'm sure someone will be quick to remind you, but Mrs. Pennington asked for help with the records. Her eyes tired by evening." "So you were present throughout?" "More or less," she said, adjusting her handbag strap. "Why do you ask?" "I understand you left by the east door." Her fingers tightened slightly. "Is that unusual?" "It depends," Purbright said, "on why one chooses that door." A moment of restraint passed between them, like a thread pulled taut, but not yet frayed. "I left because I wished to avoid Mrs. Berryman," she said finally. "She has a talent for cornering people into conversations about her nephew's career ambitions, which in my view should remain between the nephew and whatever unfortunate employer he imposes himself upon." Purbright gave a polite nod. "And Mr. Latchford? Did he leave at the same time?" Her answer came carefully wrapped. "Roughly, he seemed preoccupied. But one hesitates to intrude on a man's thoughts. Mrs. Foxwell suggested you were walking with him." Miss Dowsett's expression froze just long enough to reveal that she was not accustomed to being reported on. "Mrs. Foxwell is exceptionally observant when it suits her. I assure you, Inspector, Mr. Latchford and I merely departed at similar moments. Any suggestion of concerted companionship is an embroidery." "Embroidery," Purbright repeated. "An evocative term." She shrugged, in a manner intended to look natural. "People see what they expect to see." "Indeed," Purbright paused. "Did Mr. Latchford seem upset?" "He seemed himself," she said, "though perhaps a shade more rigid than usual, but that man approached relaxation with all the enthusiasm of a cat approaching water." The inspector offered no comment. They stood for a moment beneath the oak, the breeze tugging faintly at the edges of their clothing, though neither seemed inclined to acknowledge it. "If that is all," she said, with the delicate impatience of someone whose schedule had been unintentionally rearranged. "For now," Purbright said. They parted with polite nods. Miss Dowsett walked briskly toward the bake sale venue, her posture conveying an impression of self-possession that was, Purbright suspected, more rehearsed than instinctive. The inspector returned to the station in the later hours of the morning to review notes accumulated over the past several days. He did so with the methodical calm of a man who had long ago accepted that information rarely cooperates. As he leafed through his papers, one thing in particular nagged at him, not loudly, but with the persistent understatement of a man tapping a pencil during a dull speech: the envelope. Mrs. Foxwell had seen the vicar attempt to give Latchford an envelope. The vicar had mentioned nothing of it during his previous conversation with Purbright, and people in possession of innocuous envelopes seldom take such care to avoid mentioning them. Purbright closed the notebook and sat back, allowing the thought to settle into place, like a yet unclaimed piece of a jigsaw. Subtle, potentially misplaced, but too specific to discard. Some envelope had existed, and someone, either the vicar or the deceased, had wished very much that it not become a subject of further inquiry. The inspector allowed himself a faint sigh of professional anticipation. He would, of course, have to ask the vicar about it, but not yet. A question delayed, he reflected, often ripened into a more revealing answer. And somewhere in the quiet, well-upholstered corners of the parish, someone was waiting for that question to be asked, though not with any degree of comfort. The parish morning arrived with the peculiar hesitancy of a guest unsure of its welcome. Sunlight slanted through narrow windows in the station, illuminating dust motes that danced as though they too were mindful of gossip. Inspector Purbright, seated behind his desk, surveyed the pile of notes, letters, and marginally significant documents with the serene air of a man practicing patience as both instrument and virtue. Nothing overt had occurred since his conversations with Mrs. Foxwell and Miss Dowsett, yet the absence of noise carried the weight of expectation, which in Flaxborough was habitually more telling than an outright outburst. Sergeant Malley entered with measured steps, clutching a cup of tea that trembled slightly, as though sympathetic to the tension of the room. "Sir, a visitor has arrived," he said, lowering his voice. "Claims urgent business with you concerning the late Mr. Latchford." Purbright raised a brow, folding his hands with deliberate composure. "I had anticipated this eventuality. Please admit him." The visitor was Mr. Cyril Pennington, the parish vicar, who entered with the solemnity of a man conscious of propriety and equally conscious of suspicion. His coat was neat, though slightly worn at the elbows, a detail Purbright noted without comment, and his gloves, black and unremarkable, were removed and placed upon the desk with a care bordering on ceremonial. "Inspector," Pennington said, inclining his head, "I hope I do not intrude upon your morning." "Not at all," Purbright replied. "I trust you will forgive my curiosity, but it pertains precisely to the matter which concerns us both." He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Pray, sit." Pennington complied, though his posture remained rigid, as though he feared relaxation might compromise virtue, or, worse, reputation. "I understand you wish to discuss the envelopes." Purbright allowed a faint, nearly imperceptible smile. "Precisely. Your attempt to deliver them to Mr. Latchford. Perhaps you might elucidate the purpose." Pennington's lips pressed together briefly, then parted in a measured exhalation. "Merely procedural. Mr. Latchford had, in his own inimitable fashion, overlooked certain documentation relating to parish expenditures. Yes, I sought to ensure he received them privately, without embarrassment before the committee." "Private, yes," Purbright said, leaning slightly forward. And yet Mrs. Foxwell observed a refusal on his part. The vicar inclined his head. He was particular, never fond of surprise, however well intended. I had anticipated such resistance, but my concern was only to guarantee that the documents were accounted for. I did not imagine that his passing would complicate the matter. "The complication," Purbright said softly, "arises when envelopes intended to be delivered are found otherwise unaccounted for." Pennington's hand hovered over the desk, poised with almost conspiratorial delicacy. "I assure you, Inspector, I retained no copy. All papers entrusted to me were for the purpose of clerical completeness only." Purbright did not speak immediately. Silence, as he had long learned, could be more instructive than words, especially when paired with a man of careful habit. "And yet," he said finally, "one envelope, or something intended for Mr. Latchford, remains conspicuously absent. Miss Broom mentioned a missing file at the County Records Office, which coincides, rather inconveniently, with the day after his death." The vicar's fingers flexed once, imperceptibly. "I am aware of the misplacement. My own staff assure me it was purely accidental." "Accident," Purbright echoed, a word frequently employed in parish disputes, though occasionally one suspects it may be preferred for social rather than factual reasons. Pennington inclined his head in acquiescence. "I understand. I am at your disposal, Inspector, should you believe any review of my procedures necessary." "Indeed," Purbright said, "I do." He tapped the edge of a notepad. "It is a small parish, Vicar. Most actions, whether trivial or significant, leave traces, not in blood, but in observation, in memory, in marginalia." The vicar regarded him silently, the careful poise of a man trained in subtle social discipline. "I am conscious of that, Inspector, and I assure you any trace I have left is a reflection of diligence rather than discretion." "Sometimes diligence resembles discretion, and sometimes it is indistinguishable from the desire to appear diligent," Purbright replied. "The difference can be revealing." Pennington's glance flicked toward the window. "Are you suggesting that I am guilty of—" "What, precisely?" Purbright allowed a gentle shrug, polished with civility. "I am suggesting nothing. Only that the absence of an envelope, the existence of a penciled Q in the margin of a parish ledger, and the furtive movements of those who attended the committee meeting form a constellation worthy of examination." The vicar's lips parted slightly. "You do not think that I think," Purbright said carefully, "that someone handled these documents with a particular intent, and that intent was not noted in the minutes, which is why I am grateful you have come to clarify the sequence of events." Pennington's shoulders lowered fractionally. "I had hoped to avoid suspicion, if only to protect the memory of the man involved." "And yet here we are," Purbright said, "in pursuit of clarity, not accusation." The vicar inclined his head again as if acknowledging the truth in that subtle distinction. Then he produced from his coat pocket a folded sheet, small, cream-coloured, and apparently unremarkable. "I thought it prudent to provide this," he said. "Found among my own papers this morning, Mr. Latchford had, indeed, prepared a note he intended to deliver to me. It appears, however, that he never did." Purbright took the note with slow, deliberate care. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and marginally impatient in its undertones. He read silently, noting the careful phrasing that suggested awareness of oversight, concern for propriety, and a desire to correct errors without engendering embarrassment. Nothing scandalous, nothing sensational, yet the subtext was insistent. He looked up at Pennington. "And this note was intended for your eyes alone?" "Precisely," the vicar said, "though Mr. Latchford, as you know, did not trust any correspondence to remain entirely private in this parish." Purbright allowed himself a faint nod. "One observes that trust is a scarce commodity in such circumstances." "Yes," Pennington said softly, "and one must take care in dispensing it." For a long moment they regarded one another in polite appraisal, each aware that the past few days had created a lattice-work of intentions, half-spoken truths, and small deceptions that might one day resolve into clarity. "You have done well to come, Vicar," Purbright said finally. "I suspect the envelope will appear in due course, perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but in Flaxborough even delays carry significance." Pennington inclined his head once more, then rose with the gravity of one accustomed to ceremonial exits. "I trust, Inspector, that the envelope will reveal nothing injurious, though it may clarify many subtleties." As he departed, the inspector folded the note with meticulous care and returned it to the envelope marked with his own initials. He sat back and considered the sequence of events, each minor gesture, each marginal annotation, each carefully timed movement of the villagers, the committee, and the vicar himself. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reflection. Sergeant Malley entered, his expression subtly altered by a combination of curiosity and suppressed excitement. He held a small bundle of papers, tied with blue ribbon. "Sir," he said, "this arrived for you this morning. No sender noted." Purbright's fingers brushed the bundle. The ribbon was the same shade as the thread he had observed at the Guildhall. He lifted the papers gently, noting a slight, almost imperceptible scent of lavender. Not unusual, perhaps, but in Flaxborough, even fragrance could bear testimony. He set the bundle on his desk and opened it. The first sheet bore a single line written in meticulous hand. "The matter is neither lost nor neglected. It waits for proper acknowledgement." Purbright allowed a faint smile, more for himself than for any potential observer. Someone had chosen carefully and deliberately to communicate without revealing, to point without accusation. The inspector leaned back in his chair, regarding the note and the tied bundle. A subtle shift had occurred, not dramatic, not immediately resolvable, but sufficient to awaken the quiet, attentive anticipation that one requires in the careful examination of a parish and its secrets. Somewhere in Flaxborough, he reflected, the truth waited behind propriety, observation, and the deliberate pauses between words, and it was the nature of these pauses rather than the words themselves that promised to unravel the threads most telling of all. He did not reach for the telephone, not yet. Some questions, he thought, benefit from being asked quietly in the full measure of their unfolding. And with that the inspector allowed himself the smallest measure of satisfaction. The puzzle had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, in his favour. The late afternoon in Flaxborough possessed the peculiar quietude of a village which has long ceased to hope for surprises. Even the wind moved politely, brushing leaves along the lane without disturbing them. Inspector Purbright, seated once more at his desk, surveyed the accumulation of papers, notes, and envelopes that had gradually resolved into a pattern, though one still requiring careful contemplation. The village, with all its prim hedgerows and over-polished social facades, seemed to hold its breath, aware that something previously invisible was about to be acknowledged. He began with the bundle received the previous morning, the lavender-scented paper tied with blue ribbon. Each sheet contained small, precise notations, interleaved with careful references to the parish ledgers and committee minutes. No accusation, no overt indication of culpability, only a record, an insistence upon accountability. The envelope that had prompted so much speculation was present at last, carefully delivered, not by messenger, but by the subtle hand of someone accustomed to avoiding observation. Inside were documents detailing Mr. Latchford's intended corrections to the parish accounts, notes for the committee, and, significantly, a short letter addressed to the vicar. Its tone was cautious, meticulous, almost apologetic. The man sought to avoid embarrassment, to reconcile oversight without conflict. Purbright reflected on the subtle orchestration. The vicar, the late treasurer, the observant Mrs. Foxwell, and even Miss Dowsett had all participated, knowingly or otherwise, in a performance of propriety. Each action, whether direct or indirect, contributed to a lattice of social vigilance. Misplaced trust, polite deception, and understated correction. These were the mechanisms through which Flaxborough maintained its equilibrium. He summoned Sergeant Malley and began a quiet review, drawing connections between minor inconsistencies. A shifted chair in the committee room, a penciled initial in a ledger, a hastily closed window that had not quite concealed an observer's glance. Each minor clue now coalesced into a coherent narrative. Mr. Latchford had, in fact, intended to correct an error in parish finances and communicate privately with the vicar, but circumstance had intervened. The envelope's absence had been a combination of procedural oversight and cautious self-protection, rather than malice. Purbright paused over the note addressed to the vicar. Its phrasing suggested awareness of observation, but also a desire for reconciliation. The inspector allowed himself a faint smile. Clarity had emerged without confrontation, with no reputations unnecessarily tarnished. Yet, as always, Flaxborough retained its discretion. No one would speak loudly of the episode, the envelope, the documents, the timing of the late treasurer's movements. These would remain part of the parish's tacit record, recalled only in whispers, if ever at all. Even the minor actors, Miss Dowsett, Mrs. Foxwell, the vicar, would continue their careful social ballet, each aware of the other's role in sustaining propriety. Purbright closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. Justice, in this parish, was a quiet affair, measured in observation rather than drama. It was perhaps the more satisfying for its subtlety. One did not need spectacular confessions when the truth could reveal itself in nuance, in hesitation, in the delicate choreography of civic and personal responsibility. A gentle knock interrupted his reflection. The post had delivered a small card, unsigned, bearing only a single line in careful script. Order has been restored, but vigilance is its own reward. The inspector allowed a faint, dry chuckle. Flaxborough, in its habitual manner, had confirmed precisely what he already knew, that appearances were not to be trusted, and even in resolution one must remain observant. He set the card aside and regarded the station windows. Evening light filtered through the blinds, painting the room in subdued gold. Outside, the village continued its quiet, meticulous life, unaware of the intellectual labor required to maintain its equilibrium. Purbright made a brief note in his own hand, a simple observation for future reference. Matters resolved, envelope accounted for. Social equilibrium maintained, all parties subtly corrected without direct confrontation. No further action required, though attention should remain attentive to small irregularities. He rose, smoothing his coat, and allowed himself the merest hint of satisfaction. In Flaxborough, where reputations were fragile and observation exacting, the day's work had been accomplished precisely, quietly, unobtrusively, and without scandal. The mystery was concluded, its resolution as understated as the village itself, leaving only the faint, lingering awareness that vigilance, like propriety, was a perpetual occupation. Inspector Purbright closed the station door behind him. The streets of Flaxborough were calm, almost pristine. Somewhere, a child's ball rolled softly along a cobbled lane, a subtle reminder that life, for all its meticulous attention, continued unperturbed. He walked on, confident that the village had returned to its delicate, self-maintaining rhythm, while privately savouring the quiet intellectual triumph of a mystery solved without spectacle. And somewhere among the neatly trimmed hedges, in a house scented faintly of lavender, someone smiled, also satisfied, though careful to conceal it.